I'm here with Dr. Lance Bush, famously known as the guy who's too afraid to debate Matthew Adelstein of BenthamSubstack.com. We were just talking about something beforehand, so that may make sense at a future point. But I think streaming out to both our channels, so go and subscribe to Lance's channel, subscribe to my channel, Digital Gnosis, and we're going to talk about Annaka Harris's views of consciousness today. So I don't know, anything you want to say before we get started?
I haven't seen the video at all. I have no idea what's going to happen.
I watched the first 2 minutes, but I've seen her when she was on Philip Goff's Mind Chat about a year ago or something, and I was getting really, really frustrated, which is why, I mean, maybe she's done a 180 and it's really good, so I'm going to regret my calling it bad in my title, but yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, what if we just agree with everything and then you have this horribly titled, rude title?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'll retitle it to I don't know, Nathan's bad philosophical commentary or something. Let's go.
Annaka Harris, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You've just released a long audio documentary. How many episodes is it in total?
10 chapters.
10 episodes on 10 chapters on consciousness. Obviously, this is a topic that you can discuss for 10 hours without
But should you?
hesitation. But
Right.
why?
Should I go a little bit faster as well, do you think, or keep the speed?
I'm okay with the speed, but you could bump it up a little. I usually do 1.1, 1.2.
Let's do 1 point. There's a.
You could
thing
customize.
here. Yeah, let's go 1.15. Let's see.
Can you do 1.173?
1.17? Did you say?
Yeah, can you do that?
1 point.
I know you can't. It only goes in increments of 0.05.
Okay.
That's just
Documentary on consciousness.
Yeah. It really just came together organically. I published a book about consciousness that came out in 2019 called Conscious. And by the end of my researching and writing that book, I really became convinced, to my own surprise, that this question about whether consciousness might go deeper in nature than the sciences have previously assumed.
I just want to comment on the language that's being used already. Whether first off, consciousness sort of just being used as if it's really clear what that even means and the way it's being used. But this metaphor of going deeper in nature. It's just what the hell does that even mean? To go deeper in nature. I mean, there are certain views of reality that you could take, right? For example, reductive views, where you might think that in terms of either explanation or ontology, that there's something like explanatory reduction. So one explanation is going to reduce to another type of explanation, or in terms of the types of entities that exist, there are domains of inquiry which study things at different scales, and the smallest scale might determine in some sense what happens at the larger scales. And so you might think deeper in that sense means about studying things at the smaller scales. But she's not making any of this kind of ambiguation. She thinks that a sentence like that is just clear as anything. And to me, it's just it's this kind of talk that's the confused, saying nothing at all type thing in this space.
Well, this is a very common thing. And what I've noticed is that, there are certain contexts where, if I'm at an academic conference or a talk with philosophers, they are often quite fine with someone getting into what to many outsiders would see as tedious and boring amounts of precisification and details. So I will give philosophers their due, that they often do have the patience to get into details of clarification, but sometimes they don't. And especially in a lot of popular discussions, there's a dilution of clarity and precision to a point that it doesn't do us any good. If you're teaching physics to children or something, you have to bring things down to a simpler level. You might rely on metaphors and illustrations and examples to make sense of more complicated topics in what are sometimes somewhat misleading but simplified terms. If you want to see someone do this incredibly well, look at Sean Carroll do this. He does a phenomenal job explaining physics
absolutely.
in simpler terms. But when people toss around terms like consciousness, in contexts like this, it raises a red flag for me, because often that may give you the impression that you're hitting the tip of a complexity iceberg, or a depth iceberg, when really what you're hitting is ambiguity, and there's nothing below the surface. It's just ambiguity all the way down. And what I find is that the kind of commentary that you provide, or that I provide, look, we have our audience, but we're not talking to Alex O'Connor. So unfortunately, the flashy superficiality of pop philosophy has a much greater appeal to the general public than the nitpicky pedants that sit around on YouTube streaming on the weekend when they have families and stuff.
I want to make a point about what you're. I want to just make a point about what you're saying there. That is, it's not like so much pushback as that there is something that people sometimes do in philosophy as well, which I think both of us disagree with, which is that they sort of fortify and defend bad views via obfuscation, intimidating language, making, kind of, I think, muddying the waters so they can kind of like hide in it is a way I've described it. And it's not that we mean. It's not that people have to be more pretentious, use sophisticated language inappropriately, those sorts of things. It's more about a search for clarity, and that clarity can mean sort of just being more careful about what it is that you're saying, particularly when you're introducing ways of talking that are very metaphorical and stuff like that. So it's not I don't want to do this thing that sometimes people do of like these philosophy YouTubers, but the serious philosophy is when we talk about analytic metaphysics and I don't want to kind of gatekeep philosophy in that sense, but I do think that there are some good standards around philosophy people should have with respect to like being super clear, not just kind of like introducing a bunch of terminology without making clear why it's motivated to do that or what it's actually doing. And I think that's how you do much better philosophy,
Yeah, sure. Just to be clear, I don't think either of us are at all the gatekeeping type when it comes to philosophy. We're both as or more critical. Well, maybe not more critical, but we are very critical of mainstream analytic philosophy and much of what they do as well. So, no, I agree.
No, I didn't think you were making that point. I just didn't want people who might be watching this to misinterpret that as that sort of claim. Is why.
No, I think opening philosophy up to the public and not jargonizing everything is a good idea. We're getting ahead of ourselves here. I don't know how she's going to handle this. I haven't seen the video. Maybe she'll handle it well, but I already have my hackles raised because I'm just anticipating. Lack of clarity all the way through.
And the problem, I suppose, is still like some of the things you were saying, that within the way that our information technology is kind of like built and incentivized and all that, it's more about McDonald's rather than maybe like better things, if that matters. Not to put shade on Alex O'Connor or anything like that, but what I mean is the incentives are not necessarily always right for making sure the clearest ideas are put out there to people. Instead, it's more about philosophy is more about like entertainment and stuff. So
yeah, I do have to say though, I mean, I'm not trying to criticize Alex too harshly either, but if you're going to talk to somebody about consciousness, why talk to Annaka Harris in particular?
Well, because she's very close to Sam. She's also got like a book that sells, so you're going to get views and you'll get some revenue from that. Like I reckon, I mean, those are, at least from my point of view, I can't say for Alex, but those would be my reasons to do it. And I would not do it because I was particularly interested in the types of views that she's espousing, at least from what I've heard before.
Okay.
Yeah. I rest my case, Your Honor. Okay, yeah. Is that where you were going, or?
I mean, I just think that there's probably a lot of people that you could talk to that might have, I don't know what she has to say, but I just feel like there's people that probably have something more interesting to say about consciousness.
Yeah. Okay, let's play.
Was actually, not just a legitimate question, but possibly a really important question to be asking. And so I published that book and was thinking about what I wanted to work on next. And what became very clear to me was that I just wasn't finished asking questions about this topic. And so actually...
Okay, I know we're barely getting through it, but I think that the way that the consciousness discourse is set up is so you can't ever finish asking questions about this topic, right? My view is that the way that people are inducted into the topic is through the sort of creation of explanatory wedges. So people are just coming to the topic for the first time. They're like, what's this thing? Philosophy of mind. And they will basically be trained to think, they might think there's no problem, or they might have maybe been kind of like curious about some questions or whatever. And over time, they will be told, well, you could say this, but that wouldn't be an explanation, and this wouldn't be an explanation. And so that's why it's called the hard problem. And they'll be trained to use words in these sorts of way, which will frame their entire conceptualization of the questions and, what is even possible in terms of an answer. And almost built into the definition that you're going to be offered is something like unexplainable and something like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm increasingly coming around to the view that many of the problems of philosophy aren't merely due to ambiguity and lack of precision and clarity and blah, 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 but they're due to a sort of accumulation of contingent features of the historical trajectory that philosophy happened to take. So there are certain idioms and ways of phrasing things and ways of framing things that accrue over time and are bequeathed like an inheritance to one generation after another. And so when you're taught to, do philosophy, what you're not taught is a set of thinking tools and methods. You're not taught like, here's the equipment, go do philosophy. You're taught what everybody thought before you and how they thought about it. And you're taught things go in box A or box B. They go in box C or box D. And you have to think this way. You must. I was just reviewing a discussion with Emerson Green and Mike Humer last night, and Humer says, if you're an anti-realist, these are the only three positions you can choose.
Five, wasn't
it? Well, there's 5 positions total, but there's 3 anti-realist positions.
Oh, sorry. Okay, got you. Yeah.
There's naturalist realism and non-naturalist realism, and then there's emotivism, error theory, and subjectivism. So he says if you're an anti-realist, you must pick one of those 3. Well, I don't pick one of the 3. So like I performatively demonstrate that it's not true that you must. Like if someone says you must eat an apple and I'm sitting there eating a kiwi, well, you're wrong. It's not the case that I must eat an apple. So of course he could he probably doesn't mean literally like I'm incapable of doing so. But this is emblematic of a broader trend in philosophy of telling people, here are the categories and you get to pick from them. It's not like, I love the food analogies. There's a difference between a chef saying, here's a kitchen, here's the ingredients, cook things. And a chef saying, here are the 2 or 3 recipes you could choose from. You must follow these to the letter. And you're allowed to make minor adjustments after you've mastered repeating them over and over and over. Because look how students are taught, right? You read Hume, you read Kant, you read Plato, you read Aristotle, you read the same canon of the exact same thinkers, and you are required to internalize and regurgitate their thinking over and over and over and over before you go on to your master's or your PhD. I mean, this is the canon in academic philosophy is virtually as homogeneous and routinized in analytic philosophy as reading the damn Bible.
Well, I think though, even in that, I think the analysis you're saying is right, but I think within it, there's even a little bit more complexity than it just being like simply problematic, because the problem I see as well is that you sort of get this historic induction, but the historic induction is often a sort of like Fisher-Price version of the history and the complexities involved. So the history should be used to sort of get people to see the contingency of the positions they take, or the different biases that ways language has been used sort of puts on our framing of these questions and stuff. But rather than it doing that, the sort of like Phil 101 take on all this history stuff is to just tell you what the legitimate positions are, often through kind of like watered down versions of what people even actually thought in the first place. So it's not, and all that does then is it gives you, the kind of like layout of the few positions that are supposed to be legitimate and have historical provenance. And it says, and these ones are what, serious thinkers throughout the ages thought, even though it's not even usually quite true in a lot of cases. And yeah, it just sets people up to be like then trapped in this kind of pretentious discourse merry-go-round where they talk about what people with fancy German names said and don't actually say anything of substance,
Yeah, and there's actually even more to say about that. Just like the Fisher-Price version of this. I mean, if you go and read Mackey's original work where he introduces error theory, his arguments are tentative, complex. There's multiple variations on it. It's very clear that he's groping with new ideas and trying to put them down on paper in a way that I thought was rather nuanced, was rather interesting, and was rather worth having a look at. And yet you get, I mean, you don't even get a Fisher Price version. You get like the baby's first version of whatever, like with error theory. It's just error theory, semantic thesis, all moral claims purport to express proposition. Like just the way in which everything that he says is distilled into this like a very rigid structure that doesn't capture what he was actually trying to say very well at all. This is then attributed to him, and then it's dismissed as ridiculous. I mean, it's the same thing with the way that they handle
Wittgenstein and language. Yeah, well, logical positivism, but I was going to say, that's what I was thinking, Wittgenstein and language, like language, so it's language games, and I'm always like,
Yeah, so Wittgenstein gets this treatment, the logical positivists get this treatment, pragmatists get this treatment, and you see the same mainstream analytic philosophers have this penchant for seizing on any opportunity at all to be as profoundly dismissive and disinterested and intellectually negligent as possible whenever a dissident movement comes along. The reaction that they had to experimental philosophy, and of course there were experimental philosophers in the early 2000s that were a little too exuberant and would say, hey, 62% of people agreed with this, therefore, this is the correct position for the folk or whatever. There were some people that said silly things like that. But any person with enough charity and integrity to see that should be able to recognize that the findings are significant in ways that are independent of whatever excessive hyperbolic claims the authors made. And yet, what do philosophers do? Philosophy is not a matter of popular opinion. It's not a matter of surveying people. You can't determine which philosophical position is correct by figuring out that 51% or more of people endorse the view. That was never what experimental philosophers were, by and large, intending to do in the first place. So they just caricatured the view, and I got to witness that in real time. Just outrageous, silly caricatures. And the attitude I saw towards experimental philosophy, it was mixed. Some people were supportive, some people neutral, but there was often a smug, condescending contempt that was just so outrageous for a philosopher to have. And I have to imagine that positivists dealt with the same crap, that ordinary language philosophers dealt with the same crap. And you could see in the correspondence between, I have a friend that is a specialist in the work of F.C.S. Schiller, the pragmatist that's kind of forgotten by time, but had very similar views to William James. They have a private correspondence, and they are just raging in their letters. Like, my God, the caricatures. And it's uncanny how similar it looks to the caricatures that you and I receive and that people receive today. I mean, philosophers there's been this dogmatic, foot stomping, dogmatic tendency, a disposition among more rationalistically inclined philosophers that has persisted from the times of Plato. And they wield their confidence with an iron fist over everybody. And it's super annoying, as if confidence was a substitute for thinking well.
But it's funny that they call them the logical positivists, because they didn't even know about logical contradictions, because they couldn't verify the verification principle.
Oh, what a bunch of morons. It never occurred to them.
Well, let's carry on with our consciousness explained away. But
film producer friend of mine came to me with an idea for a film and gave me kind of a project, which was, why don't you just record conversations with everyone you want to talk to. You have this long list of experts and scientists you really want to talk to. Just start recording, and maybe this will become dialogue for a film, or, we didn't quite know where it would go. But given that project, I knew this was exactly what I wanted to do. Asking them to point.
Spoken to will be familiar to listen.
Concrete. And that.
Sorry, I was completely screwed this up. What I was going to say is I do feel bad criticizing Annaka as well, because it feels a little bit like putting a puppy down or something. Like, she seems very nice and innocent, and so like criticizing her ideas just feels like something like incredibly morally infelicitous about it or something to me. But that's not that there's any substance to that. That's just a random comment that I decided to screw the whole stream up for.
talked about how consciousness might go deeper than the sciences originally allowed for, and you talked about a sort of journey.
What did you say?
The voices don't seem to match anymore. I don't know what happened.
Okay, that's the obvious question.
I honestly think it could be his. Hang on, with 341, I will just refresh it, right? And then
I think Brian Greene
I think it could be his end, though, the same.
Makes an appearance at some point.
Yes,
and,
that's right. Yeah.
And so it's familiar territory. And so will hopefully be the subject of consciousness. I imagine that basically everybody who interviews you at the moment begins with the question, how do you define consciousness?
Yes.
What is? And I do kind of want to get there, but because that's the obvious question, I want to start somewhere slightly differently, which is, you just talked about how consciousness might go deeper than the sciences originally allowed for, and you talked about a sort of journey from one position to another. So what I want to ask is how would you describe where your worldview was on consciousness, and where is it now?
Okay. Well, I would say originally...
I'm going to have to do some pre-bunking inoculation, though, a little bit, which is that just something for people to be aware of in terms of... well, actually, I mean, you'd probably know more about the psychology on this than me, but people's memories are exceedingly bad, and when it comes to selling viewpoints, there are narrative devices that are very common amongst communities who sort of like share beliefs. So, you know, people who are into UFOs, religious believers, you might consider membership to like a philosophical community with strong beliefs to be like this. And there is a narrative device called the disavowal of prior skepticism, which has been studied. And that's kind of where people will retrospectively tell a story about what they believe that is maybe a little bit not true. And it kind of, I'm not saying she's going to do this, but just in case. And then through that, they might paint themselves as like more informed than they were, and kind of tell the story about how the explanatory power or whatever of all these problems just like knocks down. And all that is a story that just makes one view look really good. And it's probably not what really happened.
Yeah, I actually have something to say about this. I had someone, some people in my Discord server were saying, I thought you were a physicalist. I thought you were a physicalist. And I was like, no, I haven't been a physicalist for years. And then they're like, well, why did you, and someone's like, I could have swore you said you're a physicalist recently. And I was like, I don't think so. So then someone found on my blog from like 2023, is just a couple years ago, where I said I was a type A physicalist. And then I was like, oh yeah, okay. I guess I must have changed my mind much more recently than I thought.
And you thought,
and I just had this narrative in my head.
Oh no, you're back.
That I haven't been a physicalist for years, and 2 years is technically years, but I mean, the truth is, I thought it had been longer than that, and I was just wrong. And you know, I do recall thinking at some point afterwards, you know, this is not really the framing of my position that I would accept. But even so, I wasn't careful or precise enough, and if I really thought of myself as not a physicalist, I wouldn't have said that. So the narrative in my mind had already gotten warped that I always thought the way that I thought. No, apparently not.
Let's carry on. And also, Sapir Orde is saying that apparently in the Mind Chat one, and I think this is what annoyed me as well, she was quite sort of like rude and dismissive to Keith Frankish. So if this is going too well and we need to hate watch something, we can switch over to that.
Yeah, now I'm curious to see what that looks like.
I made the assumption that most scientists make, certainly most neuroscientists, at the time I was working with neuroscientists primarily, that consciousness emerges at some level of complex.
So I'm so sorry that this is happening where I keep pausing, but like all the cards are already set up by that point, right? Like, and this is precisely the problem, is that, so neuroscience has obviously a set of tools, methods, skills that it will teach people and train them in, and objectives that people in neuroscience are trying to achieve with those tools. But, you know, typically, for example, I don't mean conceptual analysis in the terms of offering like necessary and sufficient conditions or something, but sort of getting clear about conceptual disambiguations and the introduction of terms that we're using is probably not one of those things that they're being trained in. And so to bring along like a term from philosophy of mind that is so contentious and just begin to accept it in your kind of like ontology without having, you know, operationalized it in any kind of way, without being clear about exactly what it is you think you're saying and doing and what role that plays in an explanation, is like really, really bad. So even though neuroscientists can be super smart and people should rightly, I think, defer to neuroscience on certain types of questions, I think that in the case of consciousness, it really is all about linguistic use and prescription, like people being told how to use this word consciousness. And as we'll kind of maybe get around to, I think because of the way it's set up as, I think this discourse that gets set up of like internal, external, the representations that are supposed to be internal have no criteria for correct use in the way that terms that are used in the sciences will be operationalized against activities and practices where there are communal conditions for correct use. And I think that that is why there's just no criteria, you can't resolve these problems, and it's just a merry-go-round of endless discourse. And I can unpack that a little bit more, but it's just to say that my criticism of Annaka here is like, I don't think people should just bring this into neuroscience and just like get going, right? We've got, you know, problem solved, now let's start looking in the brain or something, you know? I can carry on playing if there's, yeah.
Complex processing, namely in brains, that you would only...
And she's probably going in the same direction to say, I didn't find an explanation, but it's like, no shit, you didn't find an explanation. Like, you didn't find gremlins in there either, you know, keep looking.
You find consciousness in...
So we can start from the beginning of what
okay, sorry. Yeah.
Most scientists make, certainly most neuroscientists. At the time, I was working with neuroscientists primarily, that consciousness emerges at some level of complex processing, namely in brains, that you would only find consciousness in, you know, living creatures that have a brain and a central nervous system, you know, how simple the creature could be, we're not sure. There's a lot to learn. We don't quite understand how this comes into being, but the assumption was that that is where consciousness arises in the universe. And at some point, we will understand why that is the case. So in my about 20 years working with neuroscientists, what I kept bumping up against was this realization that this assumption we've made about consciousness being connected.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Lance. But I'm going to also do something that is very evil, and I'm going to encourage people listening to this to imagine a 17th century scientist who was investigating Elan Vital and said, I kept looking through the microscope and I couldn't find Elan Vital anywhere. And I came to the point where I realized all of reality is life. Like, you know, the physical processes that we're discovering, it's all Elan Vital everywhere. And I just want to see, obviously we may think that there is no such thing as Elan Vital. And so it's just misguided to be thinking in this way at all. And I want to see if there's any similarity between maybe that case and this sort of case. I think you paused.
I got to say, nothing could be more obvious than that there is a distinction between living and non-living things. And so if you deny that living things have Elan Vital, you're basically saying that things aren't alive. You look at a tree and you don't see life. You look at a baby smile, you don't see life. That's an insane view. And we should dismiss anybody that doesn't recognize the obvious fact that Elan Vital is real. What kind of moron? It's the only thing we could be sure of. You know, there's one thing we could be sure of, that life is life. This is what the contemporary talk of consciousness sounds like to me. It sounds exactly the same. It's not any different. This is just another puzzle to unravel. And, you know, look, if history is any guide, scientists, you know, working, I'm not saying philosophers won't contribute. I think people like Dan Dennett and Keith Frankish certainly will contribute. They'll unravel the shit and the discussion will just dissolve. When has it ever gone otherwise? Like, when have scientists ever just thrown up their hands and said, nope, we need to bring in the rationalist philosophers, the anti-empiricists. Only they can solve this problem. That never has happened. It never will happen. Look, you know, look at the trajectory of history. Look at the arc of history, everybody. This is how it's going to go.
I am trying to think of examples. What are like the typical examples that people go to is like logic, right? And the analytic turn. But I think even in that, they really over-egg their case, because I actually think people, you know, if you know a bit about the electronics and computing history, I think it's people like Russell ended up actually really creating problems and stifling and getting in the way of like other things people were doing. I can't think of a good example that's like that, you know, where it's gone the other way, but maybe there are some. Do you know any? Like, there must be some, right? There must be like, maybe Descartes would be an example. where his physics or something was at least, a little bit better than what was there before.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not a historian, so maybe I don't know what the hell I'm talking about and I'm wrong about, and there's like examples, but there's still a trajectory that things have gone down. Phlogiston, Vital, and it doesn't take a historian to recognize where the winds have been blowing perpetually.
Well, on that point, in Hasok Chang's Is Water H2O, he makes a little bit the argument that part of the reason why the phlogiston theory didn't do so well was basically due to a lot of like social things where like Priestley's lab got trashed because of his political views, and so his views couldn't like compete, and Lavoisier was at Paris University, so everyone's like, oh, this guy at Paris University, Paris is the best university, so his views must be better and stuff like that. But I get what you're saying. Like, it's not easy to find someone making like an a priori argument that it's very easy to find a priori arguments that turn out to be wrong, right? Like flat planes and things like that. But it's very hard to think like Plato was saying this all along and it turned out to be true.
Yeah.
To complexity and arising at this very high level of information processing, that the intuitions we have for making those assumptions are actually false intuitions, and they're intuitions that we know to be false based on modern neuroscience. And so the more
wait, what? The intuitions are false based on modern hang on. Do you know about the neuroscience of intuitions, Lance?
No, I don't know anything about the neuroscience of intuitions. I don't think that is a thing.
Yeah, me too.
Was recognizing that the more we learn about the brain, the less firm the ground is that we're standing on when we try to assume that consciousness is emergent and complex and only arises in brains. And so I noticed this kind of chipping away of
just even this, like the more we know, the less we know. Like,
what intuitions has neuroscience disproved specifically? Did she say?
I think she said. Oh yeah. Let's go back and see exactly what she said, because I can't remember, to be honest.
We have for making those assumptions are actually from consciousness being connected to complexity and arising at this very high level of information processing, that the intuitions we have for making those assumptions are actually false intuitions, and they're intuitions that we know to be false based on modern neuroscience.
So I don't have that intuition. I mean, I don't think I have.
Neither do I. But aren't these like, I don't know, something like integrated information theory or something? Does anyone claim that they're intuitive?
Yeah, I've not come across that, but I also I'm sympathetic to some of what she's saying. I think you are as well, in the sense that I do think people are sort of like misusing some of the information language and stuff. But
well, I mean, maybe it's that people think that consciousness must be super complex, but we know that that's not the case. Maybe it's not clear, but it could be something like that. That hey, people assume that the more complex something is, the more likely it is to be conscious, and that consciousness emerges from very complex systems. And then the claim might be, okay, well, we know that that's not true.
Yeah. Sorry.
That might be the claim.
Yeah. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I can't fix it. I don't know what to do.
It's okay. Don't worry. It's all right. It's all right. Yeah, I think that it might be, this is my guess, something like people are complex. We want to figure out what's going on with people, and we say that they're conscious. You know what else is complex and a little bit similar to some of the things people do? Computer. Computer's kind of complex. Well, what's going on in computer? Well, information processing. And then maybe I think it's a little bit connected to the cognitive revolution in psychology, and neuroscience being related to psychological study, and then people kind of going, right, let's use information theory to talk about this thing and that thing. And then, linguists who are in like representational school going, information theory is really about semantic information, and we can quantify, and like all these kind of things, building to a point where once you've taken a course in some of these subjects, you think that like information has something to do with like meaning, and meaning is in some way connected to like subjectivity, as like meaning is like a first person representation or something. These are my views broadly, but I think there's a lot of stuff going on there.
Yeah, well, I started thinking of people saying stuff like, well, if this computer gets sufficiently complex, is it going to become conscious?
Yeah.
And I mean, if that's the kind of intuition she's talking about, yeah, that stuff is silly. Like if you simply add enough, complexity to your, you get enough terabytes on your hard drive or something, or you get enough software on your computer, it's going to become conscious. Why the hell would that happen? And what would that mean? So if that's what she's talking about, that would be fine. It would be nice, though, to give examples or to clarify what exactly she's talking about, because it's still in the realm of like, we're not entirely sure. We're having to backtrack. Maybe we just suck at this and we're like itching for something to take issue with. But I do think it could have been clearer.
Yeah, and to be fair to her, I mean, Alex said he's going to not ask that question up front, but I agree. Even in your delivery, you'd more want to be, even if he said that, you'd be like, well, I'm going to still have to do that, right? Because otherwise, I'm going to say a bunch of stuff, and it's not going to even be clear what I mean by that.
Neuroscience, and so the more I was recognizing that the more we learn about the brain, the less firm the ground is that we're standing on when we try to assume that consciousness is emergent and complex and only arises in brains. And so I noticed this kind of chipping away of what I thought was evidence that we had for making this assumption, and realized we actually don't. And so we can get.
I don't even know what would count. I don't even know what she means by evidence for this assumption. Like, I don't know what would count as evidence for this assumption or what would count against it, in terms of the way she's thinking here. Because it definitely is the case that we study the brain and we find out it's very complex, and that we think people with brains are conscious. So, I mean, I'd consider that to be more evidence. Or is she expecting to just look at an fMRI scan and go, that's obviously conscious? Or I don't understand the methodology here.
Get into those details if you want, but by the end of writing my book, Conscious, I had become convinced that I'll put it this way, so that we can make one of two assumptions when we want to try to understand what consciousness is. And we really are, because we don't know the answer, we're kind of
one or two or 50
forced to start with one or another assumption. So when we look out at the universe, at all of the matter and all the configurations of matter and everything that comes into being, we can look out at all of that and say, okay, which configurations of matter contain consciousness or give rise to conscious experiences? And the answer is either all or some. We know the answer isn't none, because we have evidence of at least our own conscious experiences. And so we've led with the assumption that the answer is some. Not all of them are, some of them are. And so which ones, and how does it come into being? And I realized that the reasons for making that assumption that we have actually fall apart pretty quickly upon closer inspection, and that it logically actually makes more sense to assume that all of them do. And I know that sounds crazy, and it still sounds crazy even to me. And
this is so bizarre to me, because intuition is also going to play such a heavy role here. How does it both sound crazy and intuitive at the set? I guess the other claims intuitive. That's not the intuitive one. The intuitive one is the privacy of consciousness or something. Okay.
This is part of my journey, and
just let me know if you want me to pause or skip around or anything. By the way, Lance,
no, I'm okay.
Okay.
I wanted to talk to all of these scientists. I actually wanted to be talked out of this position by smart people if I was in fact wrong. But I couldn't shake the fact that when I looked at modern neuroscience, when I looked at what we do know and don't know, it actually makes slightly more sense to assume consciousness is a much more fundamental feature of the universe. Is something that is, not. It's obviously fascinating, mysterious, and interesting, but perhaps not complex. So perhaps something more like gravity, and less like.
Honestly, I'm not joking, but as I'm looking at Alex here, is he trying not to laugh? I don't know.
Perhaps not complex. So perhaps something more
like. It's hard to read these sorts of things.
Like gravity.
I don't think so.
Okay.
And less like
Alex
high
has,
levels of computation.
Alex is very good at having a lot of composure and keeping his emotions in check. I thought he did phenomenally well with the William Lane Craig interview, where Craig just kept saying outrageous things and Alex just calmly was like, okay, say more. and just let Craig just extend that rope. I don't know if you saw that, but it was good.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have an inbuilt assumption that firstly, consciousness is a question for the scientist, maybe more so, or as much at least, as for the philosopher. That is, with enough looking down a microscope and equations on the blackboard, we will explain what consciousness is and how it comes about. And also the assumption that consciousness is kind of the sole inhabitant of, or is solely inhabited by, in like brains, you know? So maybe in some animals, maybe most animals, maybe not insects. We're not really entirely sure how it works, but we'll get there eventually. There is this talk, though, that consciousness is something more foundational, built into the universe, that isn't so neatly attached to biological organisms. The first question that might arise here, just to clear up any confusion, are you a materialist? Because when it comes to consciousness, believing that consciousness is something more than just this scientific product of the brain, for a lot of people, that means that they believe that the soul exists, or that there's some immaterial mind or something, but you're still a materialist.
No, I'm absolutely a materialist, a physicalist. And I actually believe, so this is maybe the only place that Philip Goff and I disagree. I think it should be approached through science. And I think our scientific methods have proven to be adaptable and expandable and to evolve over time. And that it just will take some creativity in finding.
Okay, this is now very bizarre to me, because then that seems to be in tension with what she was saying. It doesn't have to be in tension in the sense that it could be, obviously, those old methods were the wrong ones. But what I don't understand is how it is that coming to like this metaphysical view has now given her confidence that there are scientific methods that can investigate these things. And I'd want to know what she actually has to say about that as well, or even what role it plays if everything's conscious. Like, what in a like univocal sense, then what role is studying spatial arrangements and causal processes even playing in that? It's just very odd sort of set of beliefs to have at the same time.
Yeah, it is unusual. So we're to detect consciousness empirically? How?
Well, I don't think detect, but study, which is even,
So, like, I don't have an issue studying consciousness from my point of view, but that's because, I have a view that like consciousness is as consciousness does. We're studying certain kinds of behavior. And so it's a question in large part for psychologists, linguists, anthropologists, sociologists, criminologists, and neuroscientists and philosophers. But like, I'm studying behavior. There's nothing special about it. I'm going to cordon off a cluster of behavioral patterns and tendencies and functions and say, yeah, this is the consciousness stuff over here. But if it's supposed to be something, is it sui generis? Is it's something like gravity? Like gravity in what respect? I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. So if it's to be studied, I would wonder just like what the operationalization looks like.
Yeah.
So we're going to study it. What does that
why?
mean? What do we do?
Or why? Like, what are we getting at? Like, why are we like, what does it mean? You study something to find something out. Like, what is it? But according to her, everything about it just by introspection, and there's nothing else to be found out through studying the brain. So, so what is the aim of studying it there? I don't. Yeah. Now you defend that view, Les.
And finding ways to look at this differently, and finding different ways to interrogate conscious experiences. That's actually what the last chapter of the documentary is about. It's called The Future of Science, and I get into where I think different scientific experiments might lead in the future if we kind of follow this assumption that consciousness is a more foundational aspect. I was going to say something else and I forgot what my. You asked if I was a physicalist. Yes. So. I think if consciousness is fundamental, and even if it's not, I think the physical world that is clearly there, that we can measure in all sorts of ways, that we learn more and more about every year, if consciousness is fundamental, it simply means that there is another element to the physical world that we don't yet understand how it's connected. I mean, this is kind of taking you to the punchline of all of my searching. But the idea is that if consciousness is kind of the fundamental thing, it is actually what the math and the physics is describing at bottom. And it's why we have such a hard time grappling with the results of quantum mechanics. Because if at bottom what everything is made of is felt experience, there's a very different way to interpret what we see at the level of the quantum. And so I'm not saying that matter, it doesn't exist or something else or is created by the mind or anything else, but that
I have no idea what quantum stuff is doing to add to her theory here as well. Like, why is it that when things get very, very small, we get different experimental observations than we would expect with things at different scales? That means there is like an intrinsically private, ineffable subjective experience. I don't understand on her view why that makes sense.
I don't know that there is anything to understand. This might just be, a puddle of words with no real content to it. It makes it difficult to evaluate because honestly, my reaction to that is, what is she talking about? So you take this idea of consciousness is fundamental or whatever. Now you actually go look at the scientists on the ground and you say, okay, now use this, do something with it. Like what are they going to do? It makes me think of like a military commander. And you got all the captains and out there ordering their troops around and everything. And, you come up with a strategy and you go out there and you're like, well, defeat the enemies by having better morale. And then they're like, okay, but what do I do?
Right.
And they're like, more morale than them.
Yeah.
Like, that's not a strategy. Like, okay,
I see.
so what specific thing do I say something to my troops? Do we improve morale by giving them better food or new uniforms or giving a speech? Like, what specifically do I do? So if you just say consciousness is fundamental, I would really like to know where the conceptual rubber meets the applied road. What do we change? Where we place the beaker? Do we change how we adjust the microscope? Do we change what we do with our telescopes? Do we change what math we're doing? What changes given these, these quote unquote insights into the everyday practices of scientists in any field of science? My guess is that nothing changes and that this adds literally nothing at all to our understanding of literally anything.
Yeah. I was thinking about that metaphor that you're saying, and it's like, you turn up, you do a PhD or something. You're like, look, I've got some really, really important knowledge to produce here. I'm going to contribute to the knowledge. In fact, I'm going to do the very best thing that can be done in terms of knowledge production. And so you produce your thesis, and it's this. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, I could see it.
The final theory. But then, they say, well, what's it that you've done? I've come up with the final theory. Like, it explains. It's there's no more knowledge needed. It entails every single true fact. It explains absolutely everything. And then you kind of open it up, and it's just blank pages. It's like a blank page, a blank page, a blank page. And like you say, you're like, okay, so that's the final theory. How does this have anything to do with what we're trying to do here? How does this get us closer to better medicines, or how does this make us able to fly to places we couldn't fly before, or solve problems that we face as humans?
Yeah, well, the other thing that you could propose is what if we swapped out consciousness as fundamental for something like knowledge is fundamental, or information is fundamental, or being is fundamental? Fundamentally, everything is about being. It's about everything is what it is, and that's just how it is. You could insert all kinds of platitudes and labels for, hey, there's this thing underlies everything. Yeah. And then I still have what tools do we develop? What do we in order for science to advance? There's changes in what we do. There's changes in our practices, moving from different models of the way that the solar system works, and improving our understanding of what stars are and what planets are and where they are and how they work. We can literally land probes on them. We can land on Titan and Europa and take photos of what's going on there. There are actual practices that are cashed out. Basically, I'm thinking some sort of implicit pragmatist on the matter. How would this approach practically benefit us? That's what I would want to know.
Yeah. And then there are criticisms people come up with. They say theoretical, theoretical knowledge it's intrinsically valuable, so, and all that kind of stuff, right? And that would trigger you very much.
Yeah, probably.
Matter at bottom, what it actually is felt experience. It's describing felt experience. And one thing that's very interesting to me is that clearly, if consciousness is fundamental, there's a structure to it. I mean, we see nothing but structure, and the laws of nature are the laws.
Well, hang on there. Like, that is very weird as well. So now just think about the claims she said. So firstly, it's this intuition of realizing the privacy of subjective nature that kind of guides you. But the thing about experience, right, is supposed to be the kind of it's not spatial. It's not like this is in terms of some of the ways like Descartes and other people get at it. It's like it's not got these kind of like properties of being like divisible or being like spatially extended, which is what would be required to talk about structure. And even in terms of what she was saying about complexity, right? Complexity is typically some kind of measure of spatial structure or arrangement over time and things like that. Even in the cases of electronics and computation things, so because computation is kind of like mechanism. So it's just really weird for her to say consciousness has structure on the one hand, but that it's nothing to do with complexity on the other, because that seems to be in direct tension to, in my view. Like, if it has structure, it must have complexity that you could quantify and talk about, right? If you can know about that.
Maybe it's fundamentally simple.
Yeah, it's got metaphysical complexity, which is different to the normal kind.
Laws of nature. And so, yeah, that's something that I've become very interested in. The kind of the end of the documentary starts to deal with is, why does consciousness have a structure? How is the structure related to what's experienced? Similar to what neuroscience has been doing this whole time, but it applies.
And I see a comment, I think, from someone of yours where it says it's just a hobby. There's no value to her for these investigations. It's just fun to think about. And again, this is like, I'm not saying it to be mean or below the belt or whatever, but like her and Sam are obviously like very wealthy. And I do think that sometimes this is unfortunately what can happen, again, with the way academia is structured, the way that having a lot of money and time to yourself can be cashed out, that you can kind of end up in a position where, yeah, it feels good to you to sort of be like theorizing about deep things and talking about them and stuff. But it's not like, it's not connected to trying to solve problems for anyone. It's kind of more about making you feel good with all the kind of like leisure time you've got or something. And a lot of philosophy is sort of done like that as well, where people want to be taken seriously rather than to like get something done or resolve issues and move forward. And that does favor people with a lot of wealth, right? That's a problem all over the academy.
Is it to everything rather than just the brain? We understand when the brain is in certain states, it causes certain experiences to arise. We have a general sense of why an experience of green materializes. When I look at a leaf, we can understand the light waves bouncing off the leaf, entering the retina, being processed by the brain, and then the brain generates this experience of seeing green. The green is not out there in the world, but the experience of green is generated based on this structure and how I'm.
Okay, so how about this then as well, Lance, as a point that, so the green isn't out there in the world, but the green is like an internal representation. I mean, like what's that? Sorry, I accidentally.
Oh, sorry. Where are you going with this?
Well, what I'm thinking with that is like, in terms of the way I was taught the word green, I was taught to use words as a public activity, like, so what green is to me is like that there, right? Like literally, literally that is green. And it's all, the activity of using green language is a public one that takes place in space and time. And there's no role in that is played by some kind of like hidden internal like representation as like a sample of green that I had, a priori. And then I just had to figure out how to correspond it to the causal mechanisms that are coming in on my senses or something. Instead, it begins with me embodied and in the world, engaged with the world, like pointing at things, being inducted into a discourse, rather than, this idea of like, start with the senses and now tell a story about all the processes that then lead to the generation of green experience as an internal thing. Like, I think that kind of gets it backwards to think of it that way.
Yeah.
I'm interacting with the outside world. And so the question would really just kind of move from neuroscience to the rest of the world. You know, what is it about the structure that we perceive? How is that related to the experiences that arise? And, you know, what is the range of experiences that arise?
We'll get back to Annaka in just a moment. But first, do you struggle to focus? I know I do quite a lot of the time, and especially given my line of work, it can be incredibly frustrating. Today's sponsor, Brain FM, was created to help. Brain FM is an app for professionals seeking productivity boosts. They create science-backed music, which helps you to sleep deeper, relax.
I would be interested to see these studies, science-backed music.
It's easier and focus while I'm reading me some music from
I bet we have some n=5 things going on.
or selecting the different you might like. But that said, back to Annaka. Okay, you're going to have to hold my hand here as we walk through this, right? Because we've got this image of consciousness as being essentially emergent of atoms in the brain. A little bit like how the visuals I'm seeing on my computer right now are products of really, really tiny particles moving around, zeros and ones, and they sort of manifest in these colors and images. People often think consciousness works in a similar way. That is basic stuff down here, consciousness sitting above it. Right. You're talking in a language which kind of does the opposite. It says that the material stuff, the zeros and ones, the material sits above this more fundamental thing called consciousness. But what does it mean? Well, what's the clearest way you found of explaining to people what it means to say that consciousness is fundamental in a way that doesn't just sound like some hippie?
So this is the juicy question, I think, that we're interested in.
Hippie LSD trip type thing. You know what I mean?
So I have not found a way except just create an 11-hour documentary that leads you there.
Yes, available in the description.
It is very hard to do in a few sentences. It's hard to do even in a 2-hour interview. But we can walk back a little bit if you think it would be helpful to discuss why it is that our assumptions about what we've always thought consciousness is are likely wrong.
Yeah, because maybe we can get to.
I feel like that has to be wrong on her view, because presumably people always knew what it was because it's the most fundamental thing that they know, right? Like,
yeah, maybe she's speaking in two different domains. Like, there's a domain in which, like, our starting assumptions where, you know, we all know what consciousness is, but then we start looking at things through the scientific, you know, we have the scientific image and the manifest image. And the scientific image, maybe she's saying that is she's directing her remarks about that and saying that's wrong, that it's all about complexity and it's emergent, because she's had this frame that, like, scientists approach this as this emergent phenomenon. Maybe that's what she's saying. We're wrong about.
Can help to get us there. Yeah.
What's wrong with the initial picture?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are many places I can start. For right now, I'll give two starting places. So one place I often start, and where I start in my book, is with these two questions that I think are really useful for shaking up our intuitions. And they're questions that kind of expose the strong intuitions we have about what consciousness is, what it's doing. And the first question is, can we get conclusive evidence that a living system or any other system is having conscious experiences from the outside, from behaviors? Is there any behavior that we can say, okay,
well, I don't know about you, Lance, but like, I think that the only way that I figure out people's emotions is through behaviors.
Yeah. Or, I mean, you could also, like, it depends how you're using behavior. Like, you could read their diary and it says I was very sad. Yeah. Okay, they were sad.
Yeah. But then, and this is, you know, the next step that people with this internalist, not internalist in the sense of internalist, externalist, this like internal external division will go, is to say, but people can lie with their behavior. So, you know, checkmate to these kind of like pragmatist behaviorist type views, right? And it's like, yeah, but how do you find out that they're lying? Through more behavior, right? You never, their sort of occult metaphysical noun thing that isn't spatial and exists nowhere but does exist, like, it doesn't play a role in your finding out that they're lying. What happens is you experience more of their behavior and you go, you were lying when you said you're in pain because I just saw you get up and run over there. You know, so it's all,
and a lot of this is going to be like tentative, and you're making inferences here. And I think that even there, we have to be careful, because I think that the tendency for people that say this sort of thing, like you infer what conscious states people are in from their behavior, is that we're making inferences about what the qualia are, what this content is. And it's like, no. I think there's literally just the behavior. There isn't anything more. I mean, there's stuff people would say, but there's stuff we say, there's stuff we do, and I don't think there's anything further. So, I think that even there, we have to be cautious of people thinking that I'm making an epistemic claim when I'm actually making something like a metaphysical claim. I'm making a claim that is not where I'm saying I'm being a kind of reductionist about this sort of thing, where I think all of this stuff is reducible to what people do, what people say, how people act, and that there isn't some further special properties that we need to attribute to people. I mean, sure, there's going to be facts about what information processing and whatever is going on in the nervous system that is underwriting the behaviors, and we could figure that stuff out. And there's going to be like causal forces in play there. But I think people are still chasing after like the extra stuff, something in addition to all that. And I don't think there is anything else.
But you're saying, when you say that, that someone has, and this is kind of links back to the lying cases and things, right? But are you saying you don't really experience green then, Lens?
Yeah. So like people that make those sorts of claims, like really experience, they're going to have to, if for me to say whether I really experience green, they'd have to explain to me what they mean by that. And it always turns out when I probe people about these sorts of things that it's ineffable. They're not able to communicate what they mean. And this is a general pattern that I see in philosophy, where people seem entirely comfortable with ineffability and with insisting that there are properties or facts or phenomena that they somehow, quote unquote, have access to, but are unable to articulate what it is they have access to, how it works, what it does, what its nature is. But they're convinced that it is a thing independent of and in addition to everything else. And they'll say other things about it, that it's sui generis, it's not reducible. They'll make inferences about its metaphysical relation to other things, like it's non-physical. They seem to know a whole lot about this ineffable stuff, but they can't say what it is. Now, I could be wildly mistaken, but I'm very skeptical that there are any things like that ineffable things are things that anybody can or does have access to. And I'm puzzled that at the lack of receptivity to this possibility. Why are people so confident they can't just be confused?
They can't say anything about what it is, but consciousness and qualia are what it is. But you're saying all this stuff about all these behaviors. So do you see green?
If you're being serious, yeah, of course I see green.
Yeah, I'm being serious, but like a little bit rhetorically. For what I'm thinking of is like someone in the audience who is maybe like listening to us, but is a little bit in disagreement, and I want to sort of like clarify thoughts that might be coming up for them as they hear the sorts of things that you're saying.
Yeah. So philosophers and lay people alike will think if you're denying phenomenal consciousness that you're denying consciousness. But for me, and this is this is a little political, but excuse me, still getting over a cold. 1 second.
It's okay. Don't worry.
Imagine I said this. Sorry, still got to clear my throat.
Yeah, no worries.
My God. So there's certain sorts of observations we make. It looks like I'm occupying a first person point of view. I have experiences, like things hurt. I see red. I taste things. I smell things. I feel things. So something's going on. Now we got to explain it. Now, philosophers come in and they say, well, one of the things that this involves are these special sorts of qualitative properties that cannot be understood or reduced to certain sorts of third personally observable phenomena. You can't, they're like intrinsic, they're private, they're ineffable. They're not accessible through conventional scientific means. So we've got those going on, and that is what you're accessing and experiencing. Now, that is what I'm denying. I'm denying that. Now, then what they'll say is, well, because that's what experiences are, or that's what's essential to having an experience, you're saying you don't have experiences. And no, that's not how that works. I think what they're proposing sounds very confused. And so I'm not saying that this is a view that says consciousness is magic, but just take the notion of magic for a moment. What is magic? Stuff that's not natural, stuff that is like weird and inexplicable and spooky and whatever. Now, I'm not saying qualia or phenomenal consciousness that people literally treat it like magic, but imagine someone said, hey, consciousness is magical. Do you think you have consciousness? Now, what are they asking me? Do I think I'm conscious, or do I think I'm magically conscious? Now, if I say, if by conscious you mean magically conscious, then no, I don't think I'm conscious. And they're like, I gotcha. You said you're not having experiences, you don't see red, you don't feel pain, that nobody feels pain. So in your view, and I've even seen people say this on like Twitter and stuff, they'll be like, look, the people that deny illusionists and stuff, they think it's totally okay to stab and kill people because nobody feels pain. So they'll say stuff like this, and it's like, no. I don't think consciousness is magical. That doesn't mean I don't think there's consciousness. And I've used an allegory of this. It's a magic beans analogy, where you could have someone walk up to you. They're literally holding beans in their hand, right? They're holding beans and they say, look at these beans. Do you agree I have beans? And you say, yes. And they say, okay, these beans are magical beans. Do you agree that these are magical beans? And you say, no, probably not. And they're like, so what an idiot. You're denying I'm holding it. You could see the beans.
Yeah.
You could see, look, here's a bean. Here's a bean.
Yeah,
look, here's a bean. Yeah. This moron, Lance, is denying I'm literally holding a bean. You could see it. What an idiot. And if I say, no, I think you have beans, I just don't think they're magical. What they're effectively doing is they're saying, Lance, I don't think you understand. By definition, the fundamental nature of these beans is that they are magical beans. So to deny that I'm holding magical beans is to deny that I'm holding beans. I'm stipulating these are magical beans. So if you say I'm not holding magical beans, you're saying there's nothing in my hands. There is something in my hands, so you're an idiot. This is what people do. They embed their conception of some, so we all agree on what the observations are. We all agree on the phenomena we need to explain. What people will do is they'll say, my explanation of the phenomena is the phenomena. And so if you deny my explanation, you're denying the phenomena. And you can't deny the phenomena because that's stupid. So if you deny my explanation, you're stupid. This is what people do over and over and over. And it's a very, very frustrating thing, because it should be obvious to philosophers when people are conflating their account of a thing for the thing, and to not conflate the two. And yet people conflate the two all the time. And then this happens so often with critics like I am, and I don't know what exactly your view is of phenomenal consciousness. They act like we're saying we don't have experiences, or that nobody ever sees anything or whatever. It's very stupid. It's stupid, and I'm tired of dealing with it.
So I think there's someone who I think is asking in good faith, though, in the audience as well. I think it's a good question to build on what you were just saying. What is an experience then? And I think just my first thought, and I think, if you're trained in these ways of thinking or whatever, it's perfectly legitimate to be feeling a need to ask a question like that, maybe in response to what Lance is just saying. But just think, when you're asking that, I mean, what is it that you're curious about? What do you think stands in need of an explanation? What even would, in principle, an answer to that look like that would satisfy your curiosity? So for example, if I say to Lance, what time is it? I know what kind of sentences he could produce that would satisfy my curiosity there. He says something, I know that we started the stream at something like 5 o'clock my time, so it's going to be a little bit after that. And if he gives me a number that seems in that range, I'm going to be like, yeah, good one. And if he says, square root pork chop or something, I'm going to be like, what? That isn't the sort of thing I'm asking you. Now, in the case of this sort of question, I don't even understand what it is that you don't understand to ask the question. It's so amorphous what you could be asking. So for example, suppose I then say to you, yeah, an experience is a movement in the soul, right? Has that satisfied your curiosity? Suppose I say to you, and you're a panpsychist, the allegedly, purportedly true explanation that, well, everything is conscious and you're something, so you're conscious, right? Has that explained what an experience is? Suppose I started telling you all about stuff going on in the brain. I think the problem is with a question like this is it's so vague, and it could mean so many and underspecified. It's this kind of sense of this sense of not being clear about things, which I think is right, but the problem is that you're sort of like taking this word like experience, which makes a lot of sense when it's used where it's at home. You know, are you experiencing, are you having a good experience or something? I'm trying to think of a more natural way that this word would actually be used. You know, like, did you have a good experience at our restaurant today, or something like that, right? And it's very clear like how you would use the language in a case like that, how it's supposed to be used. But when you've taken this word and put it in this context of like ultimate question discourse, there's no real like clear criteria for how you're supposed to even begin to build an answer to something like that that's supposed to satisfy you, because it don't even know what is being asked, you know. So I think when you kind of realize that, the idea that there's a problem here goes away, and you try to articulate things clearer, and you come up with better questions, and it turns out a lot of those questions are actually answerable, you know, when you're like, well, what happens when I see green, right? And it's like, well, you know, you move your eyes over there, and you know to use a word green in that sort of situation. So like there's things that you'll say that will just make it are just so obvious as answers when you begin to actually contextualize the types of questions that you have, rather than like asking just in a general sense.
Yeah, I do think that there's a problem with asking about this in a general sense. I mean, part of it, what seems implicit, I don't object to a question like this, but it does seem to presuppose, or I don't know if it presupposes anything, but it is a difficult question to handle because it is presented in a way that is seeking some sort of fundamentality or uniformity to experiences, as though experiences are a thing. And I'm not sure that experiences are a thing, but rather a label that we conventionally slap on to a host of behaviors, psychological processes, things we're disposed to say is like a big old grab bag of stuff. And if I were to answer the question, I would want to deal with particular cases and say, like, you know, how is the experience? Like, did you have a good experience at the movie theater? So that's describing a period that occurs over several hours. Whereas, like, if I quickly, like, if I'm driving and I have to put
well, what was that though? Just to, sorry to interrupt you, think, but you know, but then you ask them the question, well, what was that? You'd be like, well, what do you mean? Like, I sat down in the movie theater, I saw what was on, like.
Yeah, what was that? As though it's a thing. It was an event that is characterized by social interactions, by a wide range of sensory experiences that I had. So it's like an experience where there's other senses of experience nested within it. There's like the smells, the sights, the like sequence of events. So there's like a chronology to it. Like I could unpack all of that. I could talk about like what I did, who I spoke to, what the movie was about, how it looked. I could describe like my perspective, like looking out of my eyeballs, what the theater screen looked like. There's so many aspects of that I could describe. I could describe the ambience in the theater. Were people laughing during the movie? Did somebody annoy me when they took out their phone and I saw the light of their phone and they're sitting there texting in the middle of the movie? So what was that? Well, that, like, which part of that? There's like, I could just go in principle into an inordinate amount of detail about the quote unquote experience. Now, when someone's asking me about my experience, they're often asking for like a summary evaluation of my overall sentiment or feeling towards the event. Oh, I had a good time. So there would be nothing weird about someone saying, well, what was the experience like? And I said, oh, it's great. It was a really good movie. I had a lot of fun. That would be an appropriate response to that. It'd be weird for someone to go, whoa, no. Hold on. I asked what the experience was. So like break it down for like, what are they asking me? Whereas, you know, if you hold up a cup and you say, what's the experience of seeing the red? Like that's a different sort of question. So this term experience is used in a variety of ways in everyday contexts. I don't know that it readily submits itself to like rigorous philosophical analysis where I could give like a summary account of what an experience is. When I have experiences, sometimes I'm talking about my attitudes, feelings, or like emotions regarding some state of affairs. Sometimes I'm talking about some sensory state. And the sensory state in almost every case would be distinguished by appeal to my memories, like, oh, well, it smelled like popcorn in the theater. So I'm relating the smell to something that I'm expecting the other person to be familiar with. If I'm talking about a visual experience, like if someone says, yeah, but what is the experience of red like? In that case, I wouldn't know what you were asking me. I would need clarification.
in the course of you talking there, I think what occurred to me is that actually, like, an answer to the question of like, what are you expecting when you ask that, is that I actually think that what a question like that, what you're expecting when you ask that, is more, where do I situate you in this debate about mind, so I know what to say about your position and views? You know, like, I think that is more like, well, what is an experience then? Are you a thisist? Are you a thatist? Are you? And it's like the question is more that question is at home in a philosophical dispute in philosophy of mind, and that's the only situation in which it makes sense, because then, given what you say about that, you can go, well, here are the problems for reductive physicalism or whatever, you know, and then it makes sense.
Yeah. I don't really fit readily within the isms, but I mean something similar to like some type of functionalist, where I tend to say it's a stupid slogan, but consciousness is as consciousness does. I think that people do stuff, and that consciousness picks out. We use the term consciousness to pick out a cluster of the things that humans tend to do, and that we extend some of those characteristics to non-human animals in various sorts of ways. We may be willing to extend them to artificial beings in various sorts of ways in particular sorts of contexts. There are I think that we use consciousness, or we attribute consciousness to things when they do certain sorts of things, when they act in certain sorts of ways, or when they tend to do certain sorts of things, or tend to act in certain sorts of ways, or have the physical characteristics that we've come to associate with doing those sorts of things or acting in certain sorts of ways. So, if I saw a person, let's say you told me a person had locked-in syndrome, I might be willing to say, okay, well, I think they're conscious even though they're not doing anything. So there's going to be a bunch of questions about like what sorts of things I associate with slapping the label consciousness onto them or not. It's going to be a bunch of different types of behaviors, and that's going to include self-reports. So if I'm talking to a machine and it says I'm conscious and it has a long conversation with me, I might be able to be convinced that it's conscious. I'm not sure. It would really depend on what exactly it's saying and a bunch of other considerations I have about what's going on. So yeah, I don't know what people are looking for. To me, it often looks like people are looking for essences and fundamentalities, where what I'm doing is cordoning off a set of externally available experiences and saying, look, I'm going to put a label or a category around these things for this purpose.
And there's one more thing I wanted to say, that I think it was when you were talking in the first bit of this pause, which was like the sorts of terms that have been introduced. So, like you said there about how you'd use consciousness. I think we're broadly in alignment on this stuff. But what I'd say is that I think I'm a little bit more resistant towards the use of the word, mostly because I think that it's so confused, and I think it is more of a specialist term. And if we're in a context where what we're trying to do is provide, good explanations of things, I think we should be careful about just kind of like introducing, terms where it's not clear that we have to. And I think that there is something like a kind of mereological fallacy of some kind going on, which would be to say, for example, you might say, if you just to kind of look at the grammar of words that you would use, you'd say like, well, the plane flies, right? And you're like, and the engine's part of the plane, so the engine flies, or something like that. And you might say, oh, well, the person's conscious, person has experiences, and so then you're like, well, what bit of the person is associated with their having an experience, or with their seeing red, or something like that? And so what you would do is, you say, well, it's the brain, of course. Essentially, it's the brain that's doing that. And then when you say, well, it's essentially the brain that's doing that, you start kind of like looking for this property of seeing green or something in the brain. Whereas I think that these sorts of things are more, behavioral overall, more associated with language use. So, for example, if you even think about the experimental setup for a lot of these things, like, say, studying cortical blindness, well, how do you study cortical blindness, right? Well, it's predicated on the types of reports that the person will give you linguistically, like how do they go on to use their verbal behavior. If they said, and they could accurately report, if someone who, by your understanding of the brain and how it works, should be like cortically blind, was always giving you accurate reports of what they were like seeing at certain distances and colors and all these sorts of things, you would begin to be like, maybe my theory of cortical blindness is wrong here, right? And I think that that's appropriate. And I think that that's because of this, thing that it's about language use. I think you said this in your microhumor stream yesterday, is like, social organism thing. Like it's like a thing that human organisms do socially. And that's where you have to think about these things, rather than kind of like trying to decompose it to some particular part of you and saying, well, how does the brain refer? Well, brains don't refer, people refer, right? Like people refer by saying that thing over there, and people point at things, but it's not brains that do that. And so you don't have to engage in this kind of like hunt for a particular thing that does the thing when you already know it's the person that refers, right? Mm-hmm. So, anyway, very passionate about a random thing that no one else probably gets.
You see A, B, and C, we know there are conscious experiences arising in that system. I would say that for the most part, our intuitions very strongly tell us yes. And there are countless...
Hang on, what was the claim?
B and C, we know there are conscious experiences arising in that system. I would say that for the most part, our intuitions very strongly tell us yes. And there are countless examples of this. I usually go to the example of my daughter skinning her.
Are you frozen? You're there?
Yeah, I'm here. Our intuitions tell us what?
Yeah. Well, mine tell me exactly what Annaka Harris says.
Now, it's been a while. It's just we were talking for a long time, so I don't remember what she was talking about. But I will just briefly say, like, she said our intuition.
Yeah.
Whose intuitions?
Yeah. Funnily enough, Lance, also in the chat right at the same time, someone said, it seems to me like I'm using other minds in the normal use. And I said exactly, I was like, seems to who? Well, he said seems to me, but like, same point that I think people make all the time, as if they can kind of like read off of their assent to something, that kind of like impression that they have is sort of like binding to everyone in all these different contexts.
But are we going to take it back to see what claim she's making?
Yeah, sure. Let's do that.
Her need, I'll give two starting places. So one place I often start, and where I start in my book, is with these two questions that I think are really useful for shaking up our intuitions. And they're questions that kind of expose the strong intuitions we have about what consciousness is, what it's doing. And the first question is, can we get conclusive evidence that a living system or any other system, is having conscious experiences from the outside, from behavior?
So this to me is a very weird question. Conclusive evidence. I mean, I think I've got conclusive evidence all the time. So I'll let her play so we can piece it together.
Behaviors. Is there any behavior that we can say, okay, if you see A, B, and C, we know there are conscious experiences arising in that system?
I haven't seen her consciousness. I don't even think it exists. So
I would say that for the most part, our intuition.
What's that? Sorry.
See conscious? Don't you just perceive it the way
no,
that
I don't. I do not do that. Yeah. I don't.
So, there's like sensory perception, but then there's also intellectual perception, and you perceive philosophically.
No, I don't
have those experiences. I have those experiences are as obvious as they could be.
Yeah, it's not like
nothing
that for
could
me.
Be more obvious.
I guess I won't be able to persuade you then. What I say about that.
Denying it, you're saying I'm not having the experiences I'm saying I'm having, and that's very offensive to me.
Yeah, and it's like at that point, sometimes I don't care about offending people, but I feel like it's not my place to gaslight someone into like I'd be like, look, I think if you had a little bit more, if you were a little bit more curious or something, I think we could probably like deconstruct what you're saying there. And I think I could give like an analysis of the phrases you just used, and you probably come around to seeing it my way. But I mean, if you say that's not the case, then let's just, stop. Because
yeah, well, if anyone's unsure what we're doing, I'm poking a bit of fun at views in philosophy that one can intellectually see things. It's not anything that she's saying.
Yeah.
Very strongly tell us yes. And there are countless examples of this. I usually go to the example of my daughter's skin.
I know I'm pausing again, but just Noah Man says she's about to say this view is wrong. Yeah, it's not that. It's more the point that the problem with what she's doing is that she frames the problems in these terms, and she's like, here is a real problem, and here are the answers to it. And that I think that the actual solution, not her just philosophy of mind solution, is to realize that the question doesn't make sense in the first place. The framing doesn't make sense, and so you shouldn't be, you don't have to answer like, what's the square root of blah blah, blah, like
skinning her knee, or seeing a friend I haven't seen in a long time. She's running towards me with a smile on her face. All of this behavior is pretty much conclusive evidence to me that there's a conscious experience there of love, excitement, of seeing me, of whatever. There's a world of conscious experiences for her in the same way there is for me. That intuition can be chipped away at, and not to say that when we assume other people are conscious, we're wrong, but that it is very hard, if not, I think impossible really, to point to any behaviors where we could conclusively say. And so this kind of...
Okay, I have to pause about that. The first thing that she's saying, that intuition can be chipped away at, I absolutely agree, because under my view, intuition is another piece of language that we use, and we use it in discussions about belief formation and revision. And we use it, I mean, we don't only use it in that way, but it's used as this kind of like statement about something that is very close to us, is going to be very hard to persuade us of, very hard to shift us of. It's going to need something really significant to get us to change, right? And all people are usually saying, I have an intuition that, is they're kind of like reporting a thing that they believe typically. So for example, if I say, I believe that I'm at a standing desk right now or something, and then I say, and I have an intuition that I'm at a standing desk, and it's really true that I have an intuition that it's kind of transparent in these cases. It's not adding any additional content, but you can obviously like infer a metaphysical theory of these things called intuitions, and also build a kind of like epistemic heuristic of, if someone uses these words as like a magic incantation, then they've won. They've got justification, right? The game of getting justification is won by one who asserts intuitions. But what I think is going on there is not that there are actual publicly available grounds for the use of the word intuition. Instead, intuition talk is a free-for-all. It's anything goes, and anyone can assert anything, as long as they're okay with their conscience and stuff in doing so, and you don't think they're lying or leading you on. And what that means is that for people who are privy in philosophical discussions to use this language of intuition talk, is that really all that's going on is they're getting caught up in the waves of linguistic use in philosophical discourses, and then they're just reporting that their intuitions are changing as they're inducted into these ways of using words. So in the case of Annaka here, she was saying she's like into neuroscience, or a neuroscientist. That's what her intuitions were. And then, her husband Sam got into psychedelics. They started saying a bunch of different things about mind, and her intuition has changed. And I think that, that's like really easy to make sense of under my view. It's not because there were good reasons it's not because the metaphysics changed. It's not because there were good reasons to believe the metaphysics changed. It's really well explained by her being around people who are using language in different ways and prescribing that use to her in different ways. So that's my thoughts of that.
Yeah.
It points to one of the problems with scientifically studying consciousness, is that it's the only phenomenon that we know of that does not have an observable from the outside. It's not something you can measure from the outside. The only way to have direct evidence of it is to be it. Right. So, I mean, as much as I think it's totally safe to assume that you're having a conscious experience right now, I can't have your conscious experience. I can't witness it. I can't feel I can sit where you're sitting, but my feeling of the table is not going to be the same feeling you have when you're touching the table. And
the thing is, like, that's not the case even on like anyone's views, like regardless of what your explanation is. Like, maybe there are some weird views that are kind of like that, but I mean, in terms of physicalists, that's not like a mystery, or pragmatists, or eliminativists. Anyone who takes these views that are opposed to this, no one is like, oh, I really thought that my touching the table was your touching the table. Like, that's just not the grammar of how you use those words.
And so that makes it extraordinarily challenging to study scientifically. But it also means we completely rely on two things: reportability when it comes to consciousness. So we have assumed that consciousness exists in places where we know it exists for us. And there are a couple of tricky things about this. One is we are the most complex systems we know of in the universe. The human brain is the most complex system we know of in the universe. We are experiencing all of the conscious things we're experiencing, and we can only get evidence of other conscious experiences from systems that are almost identical to us or similar to us. We have no way of communicating with other systems to get feedback about whether there are conscious experiences there or not. And so it's kind of the circular system where we're complex systems, we're conscious.
Okay, so executive decision then. We're going to pause it here and move over to the mind chat one. Oh no, I've ruined my algorithm on one of my other accounts.
Are we gonna return to this at some other time?
Yeah, if you want to return to this, we can carry on with this one as well. Don't worry about that. But because someone mentioned in this episode here we go. Let's see if we can find. I mean, Sapir Orde, because it was you. Do you remember where in the video it was in terms of like timings or something? I can just look for like Keith Frankish interactions, because I'm guessing it's going to be very similar at the start, and then let's see where does Keith talk. It's lots of Philip talking. Here's Keith. Okay, let's see.
We're unsure about.
Okay,
if it's something
which is it's still just a computer. It's not. It doesn't have any experience, right? My question is, what is the difference between those two realities for you? And what would you call it?
Well,
I'm hoping Keith will clarify in his answer. Otherwise, we'll be a bit lost. But
what is the thing that's missing in the robot that does not have felt experience?
I wouldn't conceptualize it as the presence or absence of something irreducibly subjective. As, is there an irreducibly subjective aspect to this creature's existence that we can never know about from the outside? I wouldn't conceptualize consciousness in that way.
No, I wouldn't either, actually. Yeah.
And then, so there isn't, the question is, we need to work out, I'm not denying consciousness. I mean, I'm conscious right now, I have conscious experiences. The question is, what's happening when you have a conscious experience? Let's say pain. Yeah. Pain's absolutely real.
But also, what is the difference between a physical system that has it and one that doesn't?
Well, it depends what it is that you're asking about. What is this thing whose presence or absence we're unsure about? Okay. If it's something irreducibly subjective, then no, science will never tell you whether it's present, because science is a public third-person enterprise. It will never penetrate into an irreducibly subjective. But and I grant you that when we introspect, it seems to us like there is this essentially private, irreducibly subjective world. But
I think you go ahead, because this is your thing.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that way to me.
But also, isn't that? Oh, did you freeze, or did I interrupt?
No, I didn't freeze.
Isn't it the case that there's exfil stuff on this as well?
Yes. So there's work from Edouard Machery, Justin Sitzma, Ozdemir, and a few other people, where what they have tried to do is look at whether non-philosophers have basically qualia intuitions, or intuitions, or that they employ judgments about human experiential states, and they often make comparisons to robots and some of the paradigms for this, in an effort to determine whether non-philosophers employ concepts about the nature of experience that track or are similar to the way that philosophers use the terms and concepts. So far, the evidence suggests that what they found is no, they don't. They don't respond to questions in the same way as philosophers do. Now, the straightforward interpretation of this is that because of the pattern of responses, basically you set up a study where you say, okay, if a person has a concept of phenomenal consciousness, they'll attribute it to these entities under these descriptions, and they won't attribute it to these entities under these descriptions. And then you give it to philosophers, and they exhibit that pattern. Then you give the same paradigm to non-philosophers, and they don't attribute things in the same way. Now, the straightforward interpretation is that philosophers think about whatever they're thinking about when they talk about consciousness in a way that differs from non-philosophers. So non-philosophers don't have the same concept of phenomenal consciousness as philosophers. However, this is going to get the same sort of treatment that I would give to metaethics studies, which is that I think there's a very good possibility that the participants in these studies, the non-philosophers in particular, are not interpreting the question in the way that the researchers intend for them to interpret the question, that they think that they're being asked something else, or they're not sure what they're being asked, or whatever it may be. And so while they give systematically different responses from philosophers, that this is not attributable to them having some alternative, theoretically laden concept that differs from philosophers, but rather they're interpreting the question differently, or they don't understand the question, or whatever it may be, in which case the measures would not be valid. And then we just don't know if they have a concept of phenomenal consciousness or not. I didn't do anywhere near as deep of a dive into the paradigms used for this, but I'm not convinced that they've convincingly shown people don't have a concept of phenomenal consciousness. What I do find interesting is that there's very little evidence that they do. There is one study showing, asking people whether Mary learns something new when she leaves Mary's room. Unsurprisingly, people tend to think that she does. But again, is that a good indication that people think that there is phenomenal consciousness and that it's non-physical? No, I don't think so, because to understand what Jackson is after with that sort of question, you need training in philosophy, you need background, you need knowledge and understanding. And participants in these studies typically don't have it, or there's no very good way of ensuring that they have it. So there is research on this. I don't find it very compelling. It's not useless, but what we do not have is compelling evidence that people do think about consciousness in the same way as philosophers. And so I don't think it's very reasonable for anyone to just say, this is how we experience reality, this is what we think. Those are empirical claims. People need to present empirical evidence for it. They typically don't have it.
Yeah. And even I think Keith's claim there is about having intuition that as well, which is even a little bit different to like, how would they think about consciousness? Because I mean, who knows exactly what Keith means by this? Maybe he himself would mean a propensity to answer in this sort of way or something. But if you mean by that like this metaphysical apparatus of somehow like of representing the world and having a seeming as like a perceptual internal representation that cannot fail to be wrong or something like, yeah, I don't know that you can get that out of those sorts of studies, right? Like it can't tell you that.
Yeah, I don't know what he means by intuition, but a general point I'll make about intuitions is that I don't think non-philosophers have intuitions to the extent that they are prompted to quote unquote have intuitions. In many cases, I think to treat it as though it's some like latent ability that they have would be a bit like saying, if you inducted somebody into mainline Protestantism, would they have the intuition of like there's a Trinity?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, yeah, if you induct them into it, maybe, but it's a little weird to go around, like if we encountered random people on some uncontacted island, to say that those people are intuitive Trinitarians, because if you converted them to Protestantism, they would typically be Trinitarians. Well, sure, maybe they would. So like, okay. And if you converted them to some other religion, then they would follow some other religious thing. Or so I see a lot of these reports that like people have this intuition. If you're not describing like a current beliefs that they could report, like, oh yeah, I endorse the Trinity, they wouldn't say that because they never heard of it, right? So if you're not talking about that, and instead you're talking about some latent disposition to render a judgment under circumstances in which one is prompted with the opportunity to do so, then you need to think very carefully about what context you're creating in which they would be doing so. Because if I say to someone, hey, I'm going to, and I convince them Christianity is true, and I get them to read the Bible, and now I say, do you endorse the Trinity?
Well, now you're foisting an entire theoretical apparatus onto them. And philosophers have a very serious problem when they talk about what intuitions they think people have. First, if they're talking about what the people currently believe or actually think, they typically don't think anything about these philosophical issues because they've never thought about them or heard of them. If instead they say, no, this is what they would think, were they prompted to think about the matter, it would be their pre-reflective, like pre-theoretical judgment on the matter. What the fuck are you talking about? They're pre-theoretical. How would a person have a pre-theoretical view?
Prior to which theory?
The pre-theoretical view on the Trinity. How would you do that? But then what philosophers will do is they'll show up and they'll say, look, we're not going to load you up with like a specific theoretical perspective. Anyway, there's exactly 5 metaethical positions that you could take. You have to have a semantic thesis as part of it. You have to think about metaethics in this way. You must do this. You must do that. Now, I haven't loaded you with any theories. Now pick one from the menu that I'm telling you is the only options you could have. You just gave them a whole theoretical apparatus. What the hell are you talking about? But philosophers are so used to saying, this is the only way. This is the way. This is the way. This is the way. The way, the truth, and the life, and nothing come to the correct a priori truth but through analytic philosophy. That, they do this and then they like don't think they're foisting a fucking heaping load of theory onto people. What about pragmatists? What about ordinary language philosophers? What about fucking continental philosophers? What about people in non-Western philosophical tradition? There's Africana philosophy. There's Asian philosophy. What if you do Chinese philosophy? What if you do Indian philosophy? Nope, fuck that. None of that counts. Analytic philosophy is the only way to think about this. And it doesn't even occur to them that they might be inducting people into a very specific, narrow paradigm. And note that this is almost always exclusively done in English by like a peculiar idiosyncratic group of a few thousand people that received typically the training from a highly elite, gatekeepy, insular community, intellectual community that reads the same canon of thinkers and has read the same canon of thinkers for literally centuries. I mean, there have been, in some cases, more updates to the Bible than the amount of updates and change that have been made to the kind of shit that philosophers read. So, like, what the hell do they think they're doing when they say, well, no, I'm not talking about the beliefs people have. I'm talking about the beliefs that they would have if you prompted them. Well, good luck prompting them in a way that doesn't load the dice in your favor. Good luck with that.
If they were deliberating under ideal conditions. Don't you call these things pseudo-psychological concepts, though? Like what?
Yes. So my growing position is that whatever it is, so philosophers use this term intuition like insane people. They just use it for freaking everything. And when they use the term, they Mott and Bailey the absolute shit out of this word. So sometimes they use the term intuition to refer to beliefs, to dispositions to believe, like you're inclined to believe this, but maybe you don't actually believe it. Like, I have the intuition that realism is true, but I'm an error theorist. So you feel the pull of it, you're motivated to believe it, but you resist it. So it doesn't have to be a belief. Sometimes it just mundanely refers to belief. Sometimes it may refer to a variety of mundane psychological processes that could be reduced to and redescribed in other terms without using the term intuition. Sometimes they use it that way. But at other times, they use it to refer to these obscure, sui generis, quasi-perceptual, intellectual appearances or seemings whereby one has a quasi-perception of what is true. What the hell is that? There is, to my knowledge, there is no research in the cognitive sciences or neuroscience or psychology that would suggest that this is a faculty that people have. Philosophers all the time, Humer and others, talk about having intuitive faculties. What the hell is an intuitive faculty?
Well,
so they're using a term like a faculty.
That
sounds like legit psychology. So like I have a faculty for visual observation. I have olfaction faculties. I have taste faculties. And then I have intellectual faculties. Okay, well, which specific parts of the brain are involved in this? How do they work? There's no answer. And philosophers seem to think that because they introspect and report having these states, that's all there is to it. Well, people introspect and report hearing from God. They introspect and report speaking to supernatural beings. They introspect and report seeing people's auras. People are dog shit at knowing what the hell is going on in the contents of their own mind. So why should I take philosophers seriously? And they might say, but those are unserious practices and disciplines. When did you empirically establish that you have these faculties? What is the external corroborating evidence that you have these faculties? Look, if someone says that they have clairvoyance or clairaudience or they could read minds, there are external means of corroborating that. So like if I think of I'm going to think of a food right now. What is the food?
Oh, popcorn.
It's not. It was tacos. Okay, you got it wrong. Now, you could test someone and see if they can do this. Now, when it comes to philosophers getting the a priori philosophical truths right, what independent means would we ever have in principle of corroborating them? Absolutely none. This is completely untestable. And so much of what they do lies forever outside the scope of what could ever be externally corroborated as a matter of stipulation, as a matter of them just insisting that this is the way that things must be or it has to be. And it's all based on private appeals, publicly unobservable, inaccessible appeals. And they can always put their epistemic thumbs on the scales. That's what every Morian shift is. That's what every appeal to intuitions is. That's what every case is where it doesn't matter how many defeaters you present. Philosophers will say, look, it's a humble intuition that I have. It could get overturned by defeaters. And then they'll say shit like, any argument for moral realism would always rely on premises that are less plausible than moral realism. Any argument against phenomenal consciousness always rely on premises that are less plausible than phenomenal consciousness.
It seems to me that there's an Beth to infinite number of spatially disconnected, actually existing universes via my faculty of intuiting a couple of claims about probability theory and
you see there are no external checks on what's going on in people's minds. So even if you assume perfect sincerity from people, like let's just assume the people making these reports are never lying. How do we know that it's not just complete screaming chaos and insanity in their minds?
But compare this. So knowing that. I think this is a super important point with respect to how confused the philosophical discourse is, though, about like this redness and greenness and stuff. And all these like internal quail that are being used, because in the case of like a color, like we have public grounds. Like I can say, this is black, Lance. This is black, and you're going to say, no, it's not. And like everyone in the audience is going to go, no, it's not, or maybe they won't because they think it's funny to lie or whatever. But the point is that like the grounds for our use of this sensation language are publicly available. Whereas in the case of philosophy, where we've like nounified these, but what about yellowness, right? Oh, well, you can just say whatever you want about yellowness because no one can, as you were saying about the verification point, there's no established use for these things outside of the authority of philosophical institutions inducting people into these discourses through what can get published, what they can teach in lectures, and what will get you kind of like ostracized at the dinner table,
Yeah. Now, the thing is, what they might appeal to is like, hey, a bunch of independently rational agents are gradually converging on the same a priori philosophical truths, and this is evidence of their truth. Okay, well, imagine a counterfactual. Imagine I'm correct, and that this is there's a host of social factors where if people mutually influence one another, people are inducted into a philosophical subculture where various sorts of rhetorical games are played, and there's various sorts of intellectual and rhetorical jockeying that goes on in philosophy departments and on YouTube and in academic journals. And some people slowly win influence and power over other people. Some people are more successful at inculcating these views in their students or their graduate students. Certain people have a book that gets a bit more play online, like representing one view rather than another view. Yeah. So in the sociological game of philosophy, certain views win out over others in terms of popularity. That can account for convergence just as well as these people having like reliable faculties. So in principle, how could you distinguish which of the two is actually accounting for a convergence?
Yeah.
I don't know what that would look like, because their view seems almost designed to be unassailable to any means of independent empirical critique, because they're just like, look, we're not playing the empirical game. You can't touch us. So, they've got, so much rationalistic philosophy is just, it's just MC Hammer philosophy. It's just, you can't touch this. No. Like so they just keep coming up with reasons why you can't touch their philosophy. You can't touch it. You can't touch it. You can't touch it. Until what they've done is they've sheared away anything that could have any practical relevance or means of independent corroboration. And they're like, and we've got what's left over. Yeah, well, I can tell you what's left over. Absolutely nothing. There's nothing left over when you take away all the practicalities of real world testing of claims.
I want to say as well, Jeff Mason said, how could agreement confirm an a priori truth seems contradictory? And now I agree in terms of the sort of like, if you accept the use of this language, like a priori, a posteriori, well then, yeah, like you're not meant to use it in that sort of way, right? You're not meant to say of it that it's just what people agree upon. But if you reject it, and here's some reasons that you might want to reject it, right? Well, you might look at what are the sorts of things people said are a priori truths, that they had equal sort of seeming certainty about being a priori truths in the same sort of way as they do about the other things they say are a priori truths now. What's things that claims about like absolute time, flat surfaces, things traveling in straight lines, the interior degrees of triangles and being 180 degrees, stuff like that. And then, later people come along and start saying things differently, and people start saying different things about a priori truths. Well, we used to think it was the case that a priori all triangles internally had 180 degrees, but now we know that there's Riemann geometry, and you can have, surfaces that aren't flat. And so we say on a curved surface, it's, it can be more or less. And what we say about the a priori truths is changing there, not because the a priori change, because that's unchanging, and not because of faculty through which we're supposed to, access the a priori change, because as well, that is exactly the same. So that, I think the explanation that says, well, what's going on is there's this word a priori, and people are inducted to use it in this sorts of way. I mean, just pick up like a philosophy textbook. What's an a priori truth? Mathematical truths, truths of reason. Like those are the sorts of things that people will say. And like you're taught how to append and use this word a priori in front of like other sorts of statements that you're going to say. And I think that is completely determined by the use of the people who are using this language. And it's annoying enough in philosophy. I find it even more frustrating when that language is adopted outside of philosophy, though, as well, because it's like, how do you even you've got to begin now getting at something like a priori rather than even you might be wanting to engage with them on the front of like that independent discipline, but now you've got to have some big philosophical discussion or something. Sorry, if you want to say something.
Yeah, well, it's just, it's a funny thing that this brings to mind is how all these the a priori facts about geometry, they change in light of changes in mathematics. It's funny how the a priori knowledge that we just have direct access to always seems to follow and be conditional on all this a priori knowledge. Funny thing that, I wonder why that might be. Maybe it's because empiricists are right, and a priori philosophers are just like philosophers that rely on a priori assumptions and this like special distinction are just wrong and are always trailing behind. That's my impression. I don't. So there's something funny about that. How the intuition, I don't understand why philosophers don't realize that, if you want to talk about counterfactuals and intuitions, under different environmental conditions, they would almost certainly have radically different, intuitions about what the a priori truths are. And that should matter to people.
How do you explain that? Yeah.
I don't think that they have a good explanation for that. I think empiricists have a better explanation for that.
There was just one point. I know we said a lot about the thing you said about faculty psychology as well. I agree that there are better operationalized uses of faculty. I think that though the faculty psychology thing comes out of the history of philosophy. And again, people like Plato thinking about the mind and using these metaphors of like a chariot being, pulled about by these different horses and all that kind of stuff, all the way through, you look at the scholastics and stuff and they start postulating faculties. And I think that this is also where you see the stuff like the internal external division in thought kind of being brought in, and the grammar of the way that sensations work and then connect up to these different faculties and stuff. And that's again why, that's one of it's a bigger topic than I think we're talking about, but that's why, combined with some of the philosophical considerations that we've been raising, about all of these issues and how, you know, more fruitful ways of thinking about language and behavior and causal explanation and stuff. You know, I'm more in favor, even in psychology, of like pushing away from the cognitive revolution, which I view as being, you know, more in line with that kind of like faculty psychology approach versus thinking in terms of more like causation and embodiment and action things.
Yeah, I'm starting to think that the cognitive revolution in many ways really set things back and was a bad thing. You know, I started looking into whether Chomsky really dealt as big of a death blow to Skinner and behaviorism as people taught me. And it turns out, no, he didn't. And that he had a profound misunderstanding of what Skinner was up to, that his review of verbal behavior is just riddled with bullshit and assumptions. And that I think driving behaviorism out of the limelight was probably quite bad for psychology. I mean, if there was one thing you could say about well, there's lots of things you say about behaviorism, but if there's one thing you could say, why do I got to use locutions like that? Like behaviorists frequently like repeated studies. They like to do things over and over. There was a sense of rigor and quantification. And I think much of that spirit was lost in experimental psychology following that. A lot of it seems more wifty and less theoretically driven. I mean, one of the biggest problems with contemporary social psychology is the lack of overarching theoretical paradigms that unify the field. One could offer evolution as an option, but many psychologists hate applying evolutionary psychology to things, largely because of the way evolutionary psychologists shot themselves in the foot with their own set of dogmas and views that they cleave to that I am not especially fond of. I don't like massive modularity. I don't like some of the other stuff that set up the field and where that field ended up going. So some of that is understandable, but it's still a bunch of problems. But, you know, this reminds me of another thing I wanted to point to, and I'm going to have to head out after this, but there's a discussion you should see with Matthew. There's a debate he's having where he makes a distinction between empirical data for things and like linguistic intuitions.
Oh yeah, he said in an ideal language, I've seen him make this claim. Is this the one that you're... Sorry.
He does reference ideal languages, and I found that rather strange. But there's something very strange about when someone says, most people think this way, or most people mean this by this term. And, you know, you say, okay, well, do you have empirical evidence that that's what people think or that's what people mean? And he's somewhat dismissive of empirical evidence that evaluates how people think or what people mean by appealing to, you know, quote unquote, linguistic intuitions. And Humer talks about this in his discussion with Emerson Green. He actually explicitly says that the question of whether non-cognitivism is true, this is Mike Humer, by the way, is an empirical question. And then he goes on to say you could refute non-cognitivism by conducting various tests. Now, when I think of conducting tests, I would have thought if you say this is empirical and you could refute it with conducting tests, that we're going to talk about empirical tests. The tests he goes on to give are not empirical
intuitions.
Tests.
I bet it's like, think about your thoughts in this thought experiment.
Yeah, so there's something very strange about the relation that philosophers have to the empirical sciences, because they'll pay lip service to something being an empirical question, but then they think that, I guess, the appropriate way to address the empirical question is to imagine sentences in their head and then think, well, what would I say in response to this sentence? And then that tells me what everybody everywhere in the world means. And philosophers are real weird about this, because a lot of times they just it looks like they see every language as like a dirty, incomplete, ambiguous version of the true ideal language. And so, you know, if you set aside all the vagaries and the idiosyncrasies of any particular language, and you just look at the pure semantics of that sentence, would it be wrong to torture people if everybody thought it was okay to torture people? No, that you're setting aside all the pragmatic features. You're looking at the pure semantics. And so because you have this judgment and you understand your language, you can extrapolate not just to every language among humans, but literally any agent in the universe would in principle agree with you about the meaning of the sentence, because you're only looking at the pure semantics. And so philosophers seem to think that they can generalize from the way they respond to English sentences to the way literally everyone everywhere in the universe, or all possible universes, thinks about these sorts of things. I don't know if I'm overstating the case. Maybe they think, nah, it's just on Earth. But I mean, that's still radically, ludicrously overstating what they're capable of achieving from the armchair. And I see virtually no adequate engagement from philosophers about this. Does this work? If so, how do they know that it works? When did they figure out that it works? So this stuff about intuitions, there's something very, very weird going on. in academic philosophy with this talk of intuitions, and they hide I'm not necessarily saying intentionally, all the obscure and questionable uses of intuition behind these mundane, it's just a belief, it's just a disposition talk, which allows them to Mott and Bailey between the mundane stuff and this really wonky, bizarre, methodologically questionable stuff.
Yeah, I agree. Just seeing some super weird comments from one guy. I don't know. I don't know if I'm having like a schizophrenic episode or something. It's that strange. Okay, so should I play a bit more?
No, I think I've got to wrap things up. So I'd love to come back and do this again. It's
we'll carry on.
The consciousness stuff.
Yeah, I agree. So it's all good. We can come back and do a part 2 or whatever.
So are we going to go to the Keith Frankish video or continue with the original Alex video? What do you want to do?
I guess what I could do, or what we could both do, is like just scope out which we think is better, and if there's one that's like much better, go with that or something. So just message about that, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. Right. Well, nice to talk, Lance. Have a good rest of your weekend.
Yep. Take care.
Let's end the stream there.